today for a very important conference on and discussions on the crisis in northern Ethiopia. And as I'm sure you've noted, the important question of how we might respond to the crisis in northern Ethiopia. The goal of this event is to explore responses to this crisis. We've convened, we're having two parts. We've convened, we're very lucky to have representation from the Senate Human Rights Caucus. And then we will have a conversation with myself and our moderator for the events throughout this afternoon, Nima Elbagir. Without further ado, because our time is limited and we're very lucky to have the presence of two members of the Senate Human Rights Caucus with us, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Elbagir, and you'll hear more from me later in the program. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. My first order of business is to say, if you want to put forward a question, we're going to try and get at least one in to the senators. Please click on the Q&A function, and I will be checking my phone to see what comes through to us. So with that, good evening from London. Ethiopia's civil conflict is now over a year old, an anniversary marked by a surge in fighting between an alliance of Tigrayan and Oromo fighters on one side, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, his Amhara and Eritrean allies on the other. Ethnically motivated arrests have surged in the very heart of the capital, Addis Ababa, where under state of emergency laws, high-vis jacket-wearing volunteers have been pointing out Tigrayans for detention by authorities in what the UN has called a mass arbitrary arrest. It is a dangerous and explosive situation, which is why it's an incredibly important moment to have this conversation. Senator Coons is the member for Delaware and a Yale graduate, so on home turf. He and Senator Tillis, the US Senator for North Carolina, co-chair the Senate Human Rights Caucus, which Senator Coons co-founded. Earlier this year, they together led the push to establish a much-needed Human Rights Commission in the US Senate. So I think a great place to start, senators, and thank you so much for giving us some of your very difficult to get hold of time. A great place to start from that human rights perspective is if you could sum up for us why you think Ethiopia and the situation in Tigray matter, why they are really incredibly important recipients, not just of the US's attention and influence, but should be recipients of the world's attention and influence. Senator Coons, if I could start with you.
Well, thank you, Nima, and thank you to my friend and colleague, Thom Tillis, who's been a wonderful co-chair of the Senate Human Rights Caucus. Thom, I'm grateful for the chance to continue working with you, and to David Simon and everyone at the Yale Genocide Studies Center. I appreciate your work, your research, your advocacy. So, Nima, why does Ethiopia matter? First, because it is a massive, complex, ancient society. It is a multi-faith, multilingual, multi-ethnic state, 110 million people, roughly one of the largest and most important states in all of Africa, the home to the African Union. And frankly, in no small part because Prime Minister Abiy was a recent recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. There were so many reasons to be hopeful about the trajectory of Ethiopia just a few years ago. And now, as you said in your introduction, Nima, we have ongoing, sustained, heavy conflict in which tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, are at risk of dying, both because of famine and widespread human rights abuses. We are in the kind of conflict moment that could easily tip over into genocide, because there are very intensely motivated, very angry, and very deeply divided populations, both in the diaspora globally and on the ground in Ethiopia, who have competing narratives about each other, about their nation, about their past and their future, that may well come together to motivate truly destructive acts. A recent report of the Human Rights Commission, both Ethiopian and UN, documents that there have been gross crimes against humanity committed by all parties, by the Eritreans, by Amhara militia, by the Ethiopian Defense Forces, by the TPLF and other Tigrayan fighters, there's a wide range of human rights abuses that have been recently committed. So it matters to all of us, not just because of our concern, our fellow feeling for humans who are undergoing such difficult and stressful situations, but because this really could become a modern genocide.
Just before I hand over to Senator Tillis, I noticed you said could tip over into genocide. We, of course, are still awaiting the US State Department's finding. When I say awaiting, it's been since June that we have been promised by the US State Department that they would issue a designation on whether or not this is genocide. Have you been pushing for this? There is a school of thought that it may complicate things further, complicate the role of the US as a mediator and negotiator. I guess the question is, why is it taking so long? And what are you doing to try and make sure that the US is seen as a moral leader in this instance?
Well, I'm going to let Senator Tillis speak too. I'll just briefly say, Nima, I continue to press both by introducing bipartisan legislation with Senator Tillis and led by Senators Menendez and Risch, the chair and ranking of our Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and by encouraging and supporting President Biden in taking decisive action through executive orders. I think it's important to maintain some possibility of space for negotiation for a ceasefire. And my strong hunch is that the tension between calling out, naming, sanctioning, and taking decisive action against abuses, violations of human rights, stands in some tension with holding out some hope that a special envoy or a conversation or an engagement might yet lead Prime Minister Abe to step back from the abyss.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Tillis, when you go home, I guess it's the same question. How do you explain to your constituents why Ethiopia is such a worthy use of your time representing them in DC?
Well, I first start by saying the hope that we had back in 2019 when the Prime Minister got the Nobel Peace Prize. He squandered any opportunity for peace talks. He's divided the country and its population. He then went on and embarked on a military operation that's brought the Ethiopian people to their knees. And I think this is what resonates most with the general population. They may not be able to understand the differences that are being worked out with the various factions, but they can understand in a nation of more than 110 million people with a military operation has destroyed a lot of economic activity, that there are millions of people who are without food and without potable water. There are thousands of people who have been died. There are thousands of women and young girls who have been raped, and men and women who have been tortured. So you try to humanize it. If you only talk about the top level military conflict, I don't think that the people understand, that most people would understand something that they would immediately embrace as something we should all be concerned with. And it's the horrible situation, the casualties of, I think, misguided policies and stepping back in progress in Ethiopia rest on the Prime Minister, and they need to change course, and they recognize that millions of lives hang in the balance. That resonates with people when I talk about it back in North Carolina.
How much of this also, if we take a step backward into realpolitik, how much of this also is about returning to a place of American moral global leadership? Senator Tillis.
Well, I think there are probably several countries where we need to take a look at that. Senator Coons and I should have started by thanking Senator Coons. It's great working with him, and I appreciate him inviting me to co-chair the caucus. But I think America's influence is waning in certain parts of the world where there are clearly documented human rights abuses, civil rights abuses. Let's go to China. Let's go to Turkey. Let's go to other nations in Africa. I think this is a time where we should redouble our efforts and set a very high standard, the standard of the Western world, and begin to use every device that we have, every diplomatic and economic device that we have. I think that we should immediately put pressure on the Prime Minister to allow NGOs and other relief organizations to come into the country and provide relief, because unfortunately his decisions have made it virtually impossible for Ethiopia to do it on their own. So I think we just start, at first we have a crisis. So we start by just the things that we can do to ease the pain of millions of Ethiopians. And then we need to systematically continue to apply pressure until we see measurable progress, talks of peace, and getting back Ethiopia to some steps towards normalcy. I think it'll take some time before we ultimately get there, but we've got to stop taking steps in the wrong direction.
Well, you make a very good point, Senator Tillis, and I'd like to ask Senator Coons about this. That point about sanctioning the Prime Minister, what has been notable is that the US has sanctioned high-level Eritrean officials, including the head of the Eritrean army. There have been no sanctions to date on high-level Ethiopian officials. And I can see your point about that tension between calling out atrocities and leaving space for the walk towards peace. But you were there in March. You expressed your disappointment publicly in Prime Minister Abe in April. We are now moving towards the end of November. When should we expect to see substantive US action against high-level Ethiopian officials?
Well, Nima, my engagement with Prime Minister Abe goes back actually just over a year. I called him and spoke with him directly right before he launched the military offensive in Tigray in response to provocative acts by the TPLF. To be fair, the initial attacks came from the TPLF onto federal military facilities, and he was preparing for what his generals had told him would be a brief police action, just a matter of a few weeks. And I reminded him that in much of my own country's history and other countries' history, there are examples, whether August of 1914, in the beginning of the First World War, or in the fall of 1861, in the beginning of the United States-American Civil War, generals on both sides said those conflicts would last just a few weeks, that they would be quick, they would be easy, and there would be a decisive victory. And instead, they dragged on for years and cost millions of lives and caused widespread destruction. I urged the Prime Minister to step back from conflict and to take the path of compromise. He, of course, rejected that advice. I traveled, as you referenced earlier this year, as a personal representative of President Biden to hand deliver a letter from President Biden to the Prime Minister. We met for 5 hours over 2 days. He is a very charismatic and engaging person. I heard him out. I listened to his perspective. I gave him my perspective. We went back and forth a great deal. And ultimately, he made a number of pledges and initially kept some of them. He traveled to Eritrea and asked for Eritrean troops to be removed. He allowed initially some access for humanitarian organizations to Tigray and allowed a human rights investigation to proceed. But not very long thereafter, I think it was in April, began reversing or failing to take any further steps on those actions. And now, as you put it, Nima, here we are in November. A group of us, a bipartisan group of us in the Senate, are co-sponsoring legislation that would take even tougher, even stronger steps. I do not speak for the administration, but my strong hunch is that they are hesitating to impose personal sanctions on Prime Minister Abe simply because they are still hoping that there might yet be a window for compromise. My friend, the president of Kenya, Uhuru Kenyatta, just visited with Prime Minister Abe, I think it was yesterday, in what is one of a series of high-level efforts by heads of state, by former Nobel Prize winners, by internationally renowned leaders, both African and from other parts of the world. We are trying to see if we can persuade both sides to put down their arms and negotiate before this becomes another Yugoslavia, a federal republic that becomes bitterly and brokenly divided along ethnic lines.
Do you agree, though, that, I mean, I know you both know this, so just for those watching, as a reminder, 400,000 people in Tigray are in famine. 2 million more are on the brink of famine, but given what little data we have because of the Ethiopian government's intentional suppression of the data around malnutrition, probably those numbers are incredibly conservative. We could already have reached over 1 million people in famine. I think what I'm struggling with, and a lot of people who get in touch with us in the aftermath of our pieces are struggling with, is that at what point does the global community acknowledge that that it is failing to the current methodology being used is failing, that people are going to bed hungry and often not waking up? That's a very difficult thing to have to reckon with, but at what point does the US administration and Congress decide that this just isn't working? What we're trying to do now isn't working? Senator Tillis, if you'd like to answer first, and then Senator Coons.
Yeah, I think, when you asked Senator Coons about the administration action, I think it's important. We've got three branches of government here. Two of them make administrative policies, legislative decisions. That's why I think the Ethiopia Peace and Democracy Promotion Act, which was introduced by Senators Menendez, Risch, Coons, I'm a co-sponsor, we need to move it through. I think that we need to reach out to our Western allies and say, look, there are a lot of things, to Senator Coons' point, promises that were made that were kept briefly, some were never fulfilled, almost all of them have been broken now. Let's get back on track for making positive progress. But we have an immediate crisis where people are dying every day. And that requires world pressure to get into Ethiopia and provide some relief. We're not going to save them all. Sadly, many are going to die, but we can save so many if we can just get the right kinds of concessions to get in there and safely deliver them food and water while we try to fix the bigger problem. The bigger problem, or the longer term problem, I should say. But the big problem is the death and genocide that's occurring inside Ethiopia right now. And I think we should use every device, including actions by Congress, to make progress quickly.
So potentially we could see Congress as a co-equal branch of government stepping out ahead of the administration. Is that what you're saying, Senator Tillis?
Well, we always like to think that Congress is a co-equal branch. But what I think we're doing, too, is giving the administration also the very clear indication that we back efforts to improve the situation. And we're sending a very clear message to parliaments across the world that we feel that they should do the same. So I think when we speak with one voice on issues like this, it has an impact around the world, and most importantly, could have a positive impact in Ethiopia.
I have to apologize. I have been abusing moderator privileges. So Senator Coons, I am going to put to you a question from the actual audience and not me. This is an excellent one from Bezu Gebru. How do we hold those accountable for the atrocities committed in Tigray accountable without inadvertently vilifying an entire ethno-linguistic group, the Amhara? And that's an excellent question, and one that we have seen the ramifications in other post-conflict situations when we have failed to do exactly that. What would your answer be, Senator Coons?
Well, that's the challenge of holding combatants accountable for human rights violations in every complex conflict. We have an opportunity here to reinforce international norms, human rights standards, rule of law by holding accountable those units and commanders, those militia, and those operators, whether Eritrean, Amhara, Tigrayan, ENDF, for documented and demonstrated gross human rights violations. It is going to be very difficult to deliver on accountability in the middle of a war. But lots of the incidents that have happened so far have been thoroughly documented. There's recordings, there's documentation. Both the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the UN Human Rights Commission, among many other NGOs and advocacy organizations, are documenting what is happening. The steps taken by the Ethiopian government to cut off access by journalists such as yourself, by international NGOs, is a significant and very concerning development. From the very beginning of this conflict a year ago, the Ethiopian government has tried to restrict access, not just of life vital food and water and nutrition, but also of information. And that's been very problematic. But I think in the end, there will be accountability. And it's important for those actors on the ground to know that the international community will be determined to deliver on accountability. One last thing, if I might, Nima, the most recent visit I made to the region was actually to a refugee camp on the very easternmost border of Sudan, where I met with whole groups of Tigrayan, mostly Tigrayans, but of Ethiopians who had fled the region and spoke about just horrific scenes of forced expulsion, of gang rape, of murder, and of other abuse that had clearly traumatized them. I think it's important that world leaders, that NGOs, that organizations, both academic and journalistic, be engaged, remain engaged in witnessing to and documenting the abuses that are happening, and that senators like Thom Tillis and myself and other parliamentary and elected leaders around the world continue pressing for access to Tigray to provide the life-saving relief that we can and should deliver.
And also, I think it's important to mention, off of your point, the mass intimidation and smear campaigns that are being waged against journalists and activists, incredibly brave journalists inside the country who continue to get out as much information as they can. So that's a very good point. For Senator Tillis, from Darren Cochran at Bread for the World, which I think is an organization you're involved with, Senator Coons. We have seen countless atrocities perpetrated by both sides of this conflict, including the widespread weaponization of food that has put 400,000, as we've discussed, at extreme risk of famine. With millions on the edge, what can the US do to further place pressure on both sides of this conflict to end the obstacles that have been placed to stop the transport of vital aid? And I know we've spoken a little bit about this, but he specifically wants to know, what can the Senate do and what should the administration be doing right now?
Well, I think it goes back, thanks for the question, Darren. I think it goes back to what I said earlier. Moving legislation out of both chambers of Congress is very important and impactful. The plain letter of the legislation will provide the president with additional tools. But I think we send a message to Ethiopia and to many of our partners and allies that we all have to marshal resources. But just think about how bad the situation in Ethiopia must be to prompt the leader of that nation to limit access. He's obviously weaponized food and water. But I've got to imagine that most of what we're talking about is understated. If it's not, then why would the prime minister have any problem with letting the press come in, letting NGOs come in, make it clear that he's not starving people to death as a strategy of war? So I think we have to talk in these blunt terms. I think that Senator Coons is a little bit more diplomatic than I am, but he also speaks in strong terms with respect to Ethiopia. But I think we have to speak truth to the world population and do everything that we can and use every device, like I said earlier, diplomatic and economic, to bring pressure on that administration to help us help the people of Ethiopia.
Last question to you both, and I'm going to take back my moderator privileges. And just briefly, my question is, much of what have been the obstacles that have been thrown up in the face of a united multilateral global approach to the situation in Ethiopia have come out of the UN Security Council. We've seen Russia and China and other African and Arab state allies block any censure, and for a while block even any open door meetings. Is this the future? I mean, should we be worried that the future is that any time the US or the global community attempts to move on its issues that are so heartbreakingly important, are we going to have to attempt to navigate a broken global system? Senator Coons?
That's a real risk that we face. Frankly, some of the global infrastructure around enforcing shared standards about human rights, whether it's the UN Security Council or the International Criminal Court, whether it's the ways in which journalists are able to move freely, or the potential benefits of social media to document and inform. There are ways in which all four of those have been challenged in recent years, have become less effective, less broad in their reach. We have, as you know, members of the UN Security Council, permanent members, who are very resistant to any criticism of their domestic internal affairs by the world community or by the United States. And I think that has made it even harder for us to have the kind of consensus around a declaration of genocide or around an intervention by UN agencies that are dedicated to providing food relief, for example, because we don't have a consensus among the P5 members of the UN Security Council.
And Nima, I don't think we'll get it from some of those who have objected so far. So we do have to figure out a way to work around it. I mean, let's face it, they have interest in Africa. They have their own long list of human rights abuses. And I think there are a number of different factors that are going to prevent us from getting it through what I would call regular order through the UN. So now what we have to do is figure out how to do it in spite of them. And we have to do it in spite of them because lives are hanging in the balance.
Unfortunately, what President Bush found on Darfur when it was that he had to issue a domestic genocide designation to be able to circumnavigate. So it feels like the US, unfortunately, is going to have to come to a path of making some hard decisions, or at least the US administration. I am so grateful to you both. Thank you so much to Senator Coons and Senator Tillis. Both of you have been so generous with your time. We are incredibly grateful to you both.
Thank you, Nima. Thank you, David. And thank you again, Thom. It is an honor to have some very small role to play here in the US Senate in fighting for and advocating for human rights. But those who are watching, those who participate, those who are advocates, I'd urge you to stay engaged, to keep your voice strong, and to be effective advocates for a global standard to which we will hold countries of all kinds, the United States, Ethiopia, and many others, for how we treat our citizens and for how we conduct ourselves in the world.
Yeah, and Nima and David, thank you. David, thank you for your work on behalf of Yale. And thanks to all the people who are watching this, because you too can play a very important role in really increasing the awareness of what's going on there and the need to act immediately. So thank you all for hosting this event. Hopefully at some point in the future, we'll be in the same room together, but God bless you and thank you so much for your work.
Thank you both so much. Now, in part due to what appears to have been a concerted campaign to intimidate potential participants in this event, the second part of the event will now feature a conversation between myself and David Simon. David?
Yes, thank you very much, Nima. And excuse me. At this, let me just begin by describing a little bit what you're referring to. We've been planning this event for over 6 months as we watched the tragedy in Ethiopia unfold and as it's taken several turns over the course of that time. We were anxious to have a widely representative group discussing this and to have actually multiple roundtables or panels discussing different issues. What we found as the date got closer was that first on our effort to have representation outside of the U.S. and Europe was that that potential participants either were strongly supportive of one side or the other, were in sort of slightly crass terms partisan. And we didn't want that. We didn't want to have a partisan argument between one side and the other over their different perspectives. We know that those two sides have different perspectives, and it's minimally interesting to have those aired. But we also know that there's a large group of people in the middle who are not partisans of the government, who are not TPLF partisans, who were who see the state of violence in their country, view it with chagrin and fear and a sense of foreboding, and that those were people that we wanted to hear from. Unfortunately, those that we approached to appear in this event felt that their own security, their own safety would be potentially jeopardized by doing so. And in a decision that we could only respect, they declined our invitations. We regret that. We wish that they could be on there, but we also have to acknowledge the circumstances why that came about. And if I could add to that, there's also, obviously, we had plans for, excuse me, non-Ethiopians to appear in the panel. But here too as well, there appears to have been a campaign of some sort we might call it intimidation, but a targeted email and social media campaign to try to get people not to participate in this conference. And I think we can circle back in the course of our discussion to why that might be the case, and in particularly why that is so worrying. But I'll just conclude by saying, for now, by saying that it's really unfortunate, and it prevents us from having a richer discussion about these really important issues than we're able to have.
But fortunately, it also allows us to leverage and gain from your expertise. So I think what would be great is if I could do the honors and introduce you a little bit more fully to those who don't know who you are and your incredibly deep breadth of expertise. So David J. Simon is a lecturer in the Department of Political Science at Yale University, as well as the director of Yale's Genocide Studies program, which is hosting us today, and the director of the program's Rwanda Genocide Project. David has served as a consultant for the United Nations Office of the Special Assistant to Prevent Genocide since 2010. So I guess, David, given what we were just discussing with the senators, what really interests me is the aspects of your work that address international efforts to prevent atrocities, where they have failed, what they could do better. But I realized, speaking to some colleagues about today, that actually we should probably start even earlier than that. We should start at the very beginning, because a lot of people are confused by the distinction. What makes a genocide? What makes a war crime? And what makes a crime against humanity? So maybe if you could start us there. What is the difference between these terms?
Thank you, Nima. Those are very important questions, and I think they're quite appropriate to begin with here, because I know there's been a lot of concern about the use of the term genocide in connection with the events that have unfolded in Ethiopia. It reminds me, my consulting work with the UN Office of the Special Advisor to Prevent Genocide, which has stopped, it hasn't continued to this day, but when I did that, we had difficulty approaching, we had our mission was to educate populations and state officials and civil society members about risks of genocide, but many countries did not want us in there, or did not want the office to be represented in there, or to set foot in their country, in their territory, because of the stigma associated with the word. So obviously, it's a word that's not going to lose its stigma. It's a very powerful word, but it is helpful to maybe demystify it a little bit and talk about what it actually means. The working definition that we have for the word genocide comes from the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, known as the Genocide Convention. And it reads as follows: in the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. And the following acts include killing members of a group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of a group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, or forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So that's the definition that we have to work with. And anytime that we're looking at a situation, and here in the Genocide Studies program, we don't have the power to declare something a genocide or not a genocide. In fact, I would say our sort of approach is in analyzing situations is to try to understand whether some elements of that crime as codified exists in a given case, and more importantly, perhaps, whether there is a risk of such elements. To the second part of the question that you asked me, what's the difference between genocide and war crimes and crimes against humanity? It's an excellent question. War crimes are defined in various places, but you can think of them as typically crimes committed against non-military targets. in times of war. Thus, they're war crimes. They could be cultural iconography. They can be civilian populations, but to target them constitutes a war crime in the course of war. Crimes against humanity is a much, much larger category, and sometimes it's sort of treated as genocide's sort of younger sibling, where it's sort of less meaningful to be accused or convicted of genocide, of crimes against humanity as compared to genocide. I think that's not necessarily the case. Many of the elements of crimes against humanity are different types of crimes against humanity, like for example, persecution, are every bit as appalling, horrifying as genocide itself. And I'm pretty sure that the victim of, say, a mass bombing or a mass casualty event inflicted by by some perpetrator doesn't really care whether or not it's genocide or crime against humanity. Technically in the definition, the words that jump out in terms of making the difference between the two is intent to destroy. In a court of law, the International Criminal Court, most notably or presumably, for a finding of genocide against an individual who has been accused of genocide, that intent that would need to be shown or need to be demonstrated.
I think a really important point, which is often discussed, is the use of weaponized rape in genocide. I think often there is some confusion about whether weaponized rape could be considered as part of genocide. But going back to that point around the intent to destroy in whole or part, if you are targeting specifically and raping women with, as we have heard victims describe in Tigray, and we also had victims describe, for example, in Darfur, the intent to cleanse the bloodline, then weaponized rape would move from crimes against humanity into genocide, correct?
That's correct. That is correct. And it's also been found by two different courts of law that were charged with assessing crimes according to international law, including the Genocide Convention. And these are the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the ICTY, and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the ICTR, both of which have essentially closed up shop. But they both, in the course of their investigations and trials, convicted people for either executing or commanding the crime of rape as an element or as a component of a larger crime of genocide. So there is existing case law that backs up what I think you've well stated as a compelling theory.
So given your experience looking into other genocides, it's an extraordinary, but I imagine very difficult academic sphere. My question is there a sense that what we're seeing in Ethiopia, is there anything that you have previously seen in other contexts like Rwanda or Yugoslavia that is analogous? Are there situations where you can see that this beat matches what we saw on the march towards atrocities or the march towards, I know we speak about genocidal rhetoric, but are there other analogous situations that you're now seeing in Rwanda, for instance, in Ethiopia, for instance?
Ethiopia. Yeah, no, I very much appreciate that question because for better or for worse, that is a lot of how genocide studies scholars try to understand things. In trying to understand whether a genocide is occurring, we think of genocide as a process, not an event, and we look at we have to look at steps of the process. We very often see steps that remind us of previous genocides, previous sort of recognized genocides
that echo,
that echo those steps, and they don't always turn into genocide, but so it's not like there's an on-ramp with no shoulder. That rather, what makes it important, and what makes it very important to sort of speak up and analyze and hold events and step in and talk about this, is that when you see some signs of a potential genocide happening, something that evokes or echoes previous instances, that's absolutely the time to say, hey, this worries me. This is something that we need to act now, because the worst thing we can do is act when it's too late. And to speak to the specific question that you asked about sort of, it's not antecedents, but similar situations. Let me say first that I think that when we talk about genocide as a process, there is, we need to think about what's driving that process. And one element is typically some form of political ambition, whether it's seeking political gain or trying to preserve political status. A second element is the erosion of moderation, the erosion of a group in the middle that can say, we reject that extremism. We reject approaches that target communities within our larger civic public. When you have a combination like that, along with more specific indicators like the weaponization of identity, the spread of armed groups, the arming of citizens, that sort of combination has been at the heart of the process that has culminated in genocide in many earlier examples. So you mentioned Rwanda, and I by no means want to make a parallel that says what's happening in Ethiopia is equivalent to Rwanda and we should treat it as such. What I do think is worth examining is how the run-up to genocide, the events that led to genocide in Rwanda, are being echoed in worrying ways, not irrevocable or completely intractable ways, I hope, but in frightening ways by what's going on in Ethiopia. And all of those things that I mentioned before, all of those procedural elements, the sort of winner-take-all need for power, the loss of space for moderation that we've already talked about at the top of this segment of the panel, and the spread of arms, the arming of citizens, and the weaponization of identity. All those elements are there, and they're all in a frightening way. From a genocide studies standpoint, from someone who's motivated by a desire to prevent genocides, I think reacting to those and quickly is of the utmost importance.
Well, I mean, some of those echoes are pretty distinct. They're very clear cut. I mean, for instance, the volunteer vigilante groups pointing out individuals of Tigrayan identity for them to be picked up by the police. We saw that in Rwanda as well.
Right, with Tutsi identity in particular. Now, one big difference between Rwanda and Ethiopia that's worth bearing in mind and complicates matters in Ethiopia is that in Rwanda, Hutus and Tutsis were generally integrated, living in the same areas throughout the country. Now, I know in Addis that there is quite a bit of integration of, say, Amhara and Tigrayan populations, but also in the respective provinces, there is a greater concentration of Tigrayans in Tigray and Amharans in Amhara. There is, in that standpoint, a risk of in the Ethiopian context, where you have concentrations of populations, and this now echoes Yugoslavia, perhaps, as it broke up, a kind of mutual targeting where minorities within an area, and that could be people from a majority group nationally in a minority province who are minorities within that province, they are also at risk of what may be, the word genocide may apply. So that sort of, and in fact, one thing that we have seen is sort of a tit for tat approach to rhetoric and allegations and violence against civilians, where Tigrayans in Amhara have been targeted, and then Amharans in Tigray have been targeted. And of course, that is I spoke earlier of the weaponization of identity. That's a fairly, unfortunately, advanced version of that weaponization that's quite worrisome.
How does social media further complicate this? Because ethnically motivated wars are always information wars,
Yes.
Predating social media. As you described so eloquently, it is the competing narratives between this sense that these minorities cannot, or these groupings cannot coexist without there being an existential cost for either side. So I'm wondering, this will be the first of these ethnic conflicts that we're seeing play out in a social media fluent world. And you spoke a little bit about the perceived targeting and the perceived intimidation for the panelists who are due to attend today's event. How much do you think social media is exacerbating this reality?
Yeah, I can't speak to the experience of the would have been panelists whose presence we missed here, but I do know that you're absolutely right. I think you've pinpointed one of the concerns of the dynamics, the trajectories of mass violence in today's world. That social media can polarize societies, and in particular, it can do so on identity-based grounds, ethnic grounds, religious grounds, in different areas. The violence in the persecution of the Rohingya in Myanmar, social media played a very large portion there, resulting in what is arguably constituted genocide against that group. The way it typically works is that social media enables people to tweet or post accusatory content, hate speech, content that castigates or otherwise blames another group for either a specific event or generically for the ills in society. Many social media platforms then use algorithms to essentially to favor, knowing that those types of messages are incendiary but likely to go viral and likely
high engagement. Yeah,
exactly. They incentivize engagement, and the people who are better at the more incendiary posts are going to get more engagement. And somewhere down the line, that means people who didn't seek out this type of polarization and extremism are going to find it coming to them. And in that situation, then what doesn't work in social media are moderate voices. People say appeals for calm, appeals for unity. For whatever reason, they rarely can catch that sort of virality that more extreme messages do. And that's a recipe for polarization, like we've seen in Ethiopia, I'm afraid, and we may be seeing in many situations throughout the world.
Well, I was going to say, as you were describing that, it sounded like the radicalization of the January 6th insurrectionists, or the radicalization of some of the more virulent anti-vaxxers here in the UK or in Europe, or pro-Brexiteers. I mean, it sounds like a lot of the dynamics that we would associate with inter-ethnic, intercommunal violence are playing out in the US and in Europe as well.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. Without, let me be clear, there's no implication in what you said or in my agreement with that anti-vax sentiment or pro-Brexiteering is genocidal.
Yes,
of course not. But yeah, it favors, in all of these events, there's something that favors the extreme, and effectively, algorithmically perhaps discriminates against the moderate. And my shtick, as it were, when I was my take-home point when I participated in these UN workshops in the past decade was that really the key sort of preventative tool, the best prevention against genocide, as far as I can tell empirically, globally, is a robust, empowered, moderate middle that rejects extremist appeals. And unfortunately, social media works in the exact opposite direction. Doesn't mean it causes genocide everywhere, but the dynamics can play right into the hands of those that do seek to mobilize in sort of genocidal turns.
I wonder, given that you have studied the ways that these cycles, these footsteps towards atrocities and potentially towards genocide have played out in the past, how demoralizing is it to watch the violence continue to flare up in Ethiopia without a coherent global response? Ethiopia has, for the last 5 years or so, been on the Holocaust Memorial Museum's watch list in terms of concerns around intercommunal violence. It has, Senator Coons just mentioned that as early as the end of last year, that when we saw him publicly speak with Prime Minister Abe, that was months after he first started engaging on this. And yet here we still are. Does it feel like the global community fails to learn the lessons of each subsequent atrocity and each subsequent genocide?
Unfortunately, I think that's an accurate take. I would say to some extent, thinking of the lessons of the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda in particular, that there were some valuable lessons learned, and including by the genocide scholar community and the genocide, we'll call it the watchdog community, the USHMM, whom you mentioned, other civil society organizations said, hey, we've got to pay a lot more attention to what's going on in the world so that we can detect situations early, we can detect risks, and we can try to prevent risks from risky situations from spiraling out of control. What hasn't really changed is the international global order that, if you will, permits these things to happen. This was something that Senator Tillis brought up in his one of his later comments in the conversation earlier. And he was referring to the Security Council, where for the UN, the whole UN, to do something in terms of whether it's sanctions or, heaven forbid, an intervention, or sending peacekeepers, authorizing a peacekeeping force, ideally with the consent of the parties involved, but sometimes without the consent. All of that to happen requires a Security Council resolution. And a Security Council resolution requires a consensus among the 5 countries that have the ability to veto, the permanent ability to veto any resolution that comes across their table. And those 5, of course, are the United States, France, United Kingdom, China, and Russia. What we've been seeing in many situations over the last 2 decades is that there's always, at least, even with a renewed commitment on paper, in speeches by the Secretaries General of the United Nations over time, to embrace the responsibility to protect vulnerable populations. Even with all of that, it comes down to some robust action. If robust action is required, comes down to the assent of the Security Council, and that has been virtually impossible to obtain, at least in the past 10 years, on these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's quite telling when we talk about the echoes of atrocities and genocides past, that the UN Security Council also blocked a genocide resolution on Rwanda. And it was France that time. We have different actors now, but the kind of the global equilibrium remains the same, that there are always actors acting in their own interest or in the interest of their perceived allies. I just have time for one question. This has been such a fascinating conversation, so forgive me if I've indulged myself with regards to
I really
asking.
appreciate it.
I guess sometimes when you look at the past, it can allow you to see a path forward. And I'm not asking you to say what you would do if you woke up and became world king, but in an ideal world, what do you think could be the one thing that could help stop this march towards mass atrocity?
It would have to start with an agreement of the militarized forces in Ethiopia. That includes the army of the government of Ethiopia, and it especially includes the TPLF, to at least to lay down their weapons in the current campaign, to stop fighting one another. As long as there's fighting going on, there's only going to be further polarization, further radicalization, and a greater risk of mass atrocity crimes, including genocide. But if there can be some movement to the negotiating table, if there can be talks, if it's encouraging to hear that President Kenyatta in Kenya is working to sponsor that. If IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development in the Horn of Africa, can successfully bring the sides together, if the African Union can do something along those lines, it absolutely has to start there. There'll be no convincing the population and subpopulations of Ethiopia, that is those who sort of follow the narrative on one side or the other, that it's time to let go and it's time to sort of embrace the unity of the country if there's continued conflict. So that threat of war, which is in many times over the past 12 months been very active war and active violence and occupation of villages by both sides in different areas, that has to stop. And that is what might, I know it's a cliche, but give peace a chance in this particular situation.
So going back to the conversation with Senator Coons and Senator Tillis, regarding the hard choices facing the US to get the Ethiopian government and the Tigrayan and allied forces to the table, your advice would be do the hard thing, do what it takes to get them to the table, because that's the only chance.
I think that that's fair. Getting to the table is, there's a in peace studies, there's 1,000 articles and books about how do you get people to the table, and they won't go there if they don't want to. But so you have to create incentives that make it desirable to be at the table, and those incentives can be positive inducements, or they can be negative on the other side, threats of sanctions and things like that. I believe that toolkit, that toolbox is certainly consideration of the use of those tools in that toolbox is entirely appropriate in this situation. So how they're used is how they're leveraged, how they can be made effective, how they might actually be able to reach out, or people might be able to reach out to this moderate middle within Ethiopia while it still exists. It's a very difficult question, and I won't pretend to know the answers there. But in a general sense, I do believe that that's the direction where the policy from the outside, from this question, as we've asked from the beginning about how do we from the outside, because we are all outsiders here in some respect, how do we respond to the crisis and the horrific scenes and episodes that have been unfolding? It's a question that I think that we have to search for answers, because choosing not to respond is that was one of the lessons that we hopefully did learn from Rwanda, that choosing not to respond or choosing to retreat, as was done in Rwanda, is a grave, grave mistake.
Thank you so much, David. It has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me. And with that, I'm handing back the honors to you.
Thank you so much, Nima, for agreeing to spend really a difficult hour with us, because these topics are not easy to discuss. Nothing is light about this, or is meant to be taken lightly. And even just as we mentioned before, discussing the idea of genocide is taken to be incendiary. And therefore, despite our intentions and goodwill and good faith to the contrary, is liable to be taken the wrong way. So so I appreciate your being willing to do that for longer than myself, longer than for our guests from the Senate Human Rights Caucus. I appreciate the grace with which you've moderated both events. So I thank you deeply. With that, that will conclude the event, the Responding to the Crisis in Northern Ethiopia event, sponsored by the Yale Genocide Studies program, and with the U.S. Senate Human Rights Caucus serving as an honorary co-host. We hope that this discussion has been illuminating. We hope that it has helped you think about things, that it has inspired the people listening in and watching to think about ways that they, their country, can make a positive change in this troubling situation. On that note, I thank you all for coming. I see that there are over 1,200 people in attendance. I hope this has been a meaningful experience, and I invite you to return to future Yale Genocide Studies programs events. Thank you.